these Christian philosophy debates, they were very important for European philosophy and European theology. And they're not very well known over here in the United States. And one of the reasons why is there's kind of a vicious circle. And it's kind of good that I have a chalkboard. I'm going to do this lecture in part as lecture, in part as soliciting answers from you. How many of you read French? Nobody reads French? Well, just professors. Adam should read French. He works on Blondel. One person reads French. It is kind of a dying language. It's unfortunate, but you know, it's not as important, say, as Chinese or Arabic or Spanish these days. So if you want to do scholarship, what do you have to have if you want to research French authors? How do you do it? Has this class included any French authors? No. It included some German ones,
yeah.
Right? Somebody just talked about Ratzinger, now Benedict XVI. How did you read Ratzinger? He does speak English, right? But he didn't write in English. Somebody had to provide a translation. And without that translation, how many of you read German? A few. Yeah. Again, Americans, you know, we're not very good at pushing languages. So if it's not available in translation, odds are you're not going to read it. And if it's not available in translation, that leads to a lack of interest, right? If it is available in translation, now you can be interested in it. You can talk about it with other people. You can publish things on it. You can hold conferences because you're all on the same page. If there's no interest, who's going to translate things? So there's a lot of work out there in French, in German, especially in Italian and Spanish, that just simply hasn't been translated. Really brilliant, interesting, groundbreaking, philosophical, theological, historical, you name it. There's a lot of work out there that doesn't get translated. And the reason it doesn't get that is because of this cycle. Because it didn't get translated right away, people assumed it wasn't important. And because they assumed it wasn't important, nobody else comes along to translate it. At least as far as the Christian philosophy debates goes, my impetus for doing this was originally as a Blondel scholar. Blondel was very involved in these debates, and his early works had been translated, but his later works haven't. So I wanted to translate some of those things, and a friend of mine sent these things to me in the mail and said, why don't you translate this stuff? So as I did it, I started finding more and more works pertaining to these debates. And here in the United States, there's sort of a standard line that you get about the Christian philosophy debates. They started in 1931, and they were over fairly quickly. The main people who were involved were these existentialist Thomists, Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain, and who were their protagonists or their antagonists, either rationalist philosophers like Emile Breillet, or neo-scholastics like Fernand von Steenbergen. And that's it. That's all there is to the story. Blondel got a little bit involved, but really not that involved, and there's the end of the story. Well, the picture's a lot bigger than that. There were about 50 people involved in these debates, and they went on from 1931 to about 1936 when they started to peter out. You guys are going to be looking at ressourcement theologians later, right?
We touched on him a little bit
Okay.
already. And
so you talked about Henri de Lubac at all?
we maybe spent just a little bit of time when we were in Ratzinger touching on him.
Yeah, he would be further along. Somebody influenced by de Lubac. Henri de Lubac is a young man at the time of these debates. He's sort of sounding off at the very end of it. So by the time that he's actually writing about it and summarizing it, we think the debates are over. But, so from 1931 to 1936, you have about 50 different people weighing in. I brought along a few props, you might say. Be careful with these are very old. This is Blondel's Problème de la philosophie catholique. Still not translated. Probably not going to be translated for a while, unless people decide they want to do it. And this is a whole book that he wrote in 1932 and published on the topic. Most of the English language scholarship hasn't read this. So I'll pass this around. This was actually the second, this is the account of meetings at the second session of the Société Thomiste. Thomist philosophers and theologians got together in Europe, mainly French-speaking, some Italian, some German-speaking ones, and they would get together and have these days of study at a place called Juvisy. And they had a theme. The first theme was actually phenomenology. The Thomists were very interested in that. This time it was Christian philosophy. And two of them made presentations. Some of them made impromptu presentations because it took up so much time talking. And they argued back and forth about this. So this is a really live issue. This is a viable topic for discussion. Why would people argue about this sort of thing? Well, you know, the American context is different than the French context. Here in America, let's say you had to give a number. How many denominations do you think we have? It's kind of a trick question, isn't it? Why is it a trick question? It's hard to count them to begin with, right? And then there's all these splits that take place. We're used to a pretty diverse religious setting. And it's been that way in America since the start. It's more diverse now than it was previously, but that's part of our cultural landscape. In France, if you were Christian, you belonged to mainly one of two churches. You were either Roman Catholic or you were Reformed Protestant. You were Huguenot. And here in America, although in recent times the government has been fairly secularized, and some administrations have been more or less hostile to religion, in America, for the most part, there hasn't been a lot of controversy about sort of stripping the public space of religion until the last maybe 40 years. In France, that was taking place from the Revolution on. And the French Third Republic was very secular. So secular that Maurice Blondel actually couldn't get a job for the first 2 years because he'd written his doctoral dissertation in a direction that ultimately took it towards religion. And so they said, well, this is theology, this is not philosophy, you can't be hired. And it was a state administration. If you wanted to get a job, it wasn't like here where you apply at different places. There was one monolithic state educational institution, and you either belonged to that or you didn't. There were the Catholic institutions as well, but they were pretty small. So there was this big push to sort of secularize philosophy. And a lot of religious philosophers themselves bought into this, in part because if you wanted to get a job, you had to be able to communicate with those who were not religious, and in part because they had different conceptions of philosophy. One of the things that comes out of this debate that's very clear is there's no one single conception of philosophy. And the conception of philosophy that you have is really going to have a huge effect on your view of whether Christian philosophy is possible, what kind of relations philosophy would have with theology, and if theology is even a rational discipline. So from the perspective of some of the philosophers involved in the debate, just like today, some of the philosophers around today, what you would be doing in this classroom would be pure gobbledygook, right? Some people would say this is purely irrational, can't have any connection to intellectual culture, you guys are just spinning your wheels. Other perspectives take a very different line. And so that's part of what they're fighting about in these debates. Now, one of the things that I'm kind of curious, I've never actually talked about the debates with budding theologians. I've talked about them a lot with philosophers. And I think that theologians have different preoccupations than philosophers do. We philosophers tend to obsess quite a bit about the provability of things and whether we can make a strictly rational argument without making any reference to, say, Scripture or the history of the church or anything like that. We like to try to make arguments that way, even though very often it's not possible when it comes to matters of philosophy of religion. So what are the preoccupations that theologians have? You're all religion majors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Theology or religion majors? So what is it that you intend to do with this? And how does philosophy fit in with that? Why bother with it?
Society.
Okay, society. And how... Society does not seem to be particularly interested in philosophy.
No, they're not. It helps us view their way of living and how they function in life.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Society on its surface is not interested in philosophy. Society, in its ground, is conditioned by philosophy because everybody has a particular philosophical perspective on the big issues. And some of those big issues are ones that impinge on theology. Does God exist? Many people have decided that question one way or another, and that's not just a theological question, it's also a philosophical question. What else would you care about philosophy for? Why would these debates have anything to do with your lives or your profession as you're going to practice it? It may not for some of you. If you're going to be just a biblical hermeneut, probably doesn't have much to do with your life, right? All you're going to do is explicate Scripture? Yeah.
I guess philosophy influences language, and we have to use language to articulate our faith as well.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I was actually kind of joking with you, though, too. If you're doing scriptural hermeneutics, is philosophy going to be important for you? Well, think about some of the big Scripture scholars of this century. Some of the ones who made huge impacts. Take Bultmann, for example. I don't know if you guys have studied. Did you guys study him?
Not really in
Rudolf
this
Bultmann?
class.
In order to understand Bultmann, you have to read Heidegger, because Bultmann was influenced by Heidegger. In order to understand... Who have you studied in this class?
We focused on Ratzinger, and then we read,
Who's a philosopher.
very much a philosopher.
Right, yeah.
We read some African theology,
Okay.
and then ended up with Nicholas Lash
Okay.
most recently.
So what would you, it'd be silly to ask, what would you have to read in order to understand Ratzinger fully, because he's read the entire corpus of philosophy and engaged just about everybody, because he writes a lot. As a matter of fact, he's got an interesting book out where he dialogues with Jürgen Habermas about the nature of reason and whether it has to be purely secular, whether religion has a role in society. So theologians are tied in with philosophers.
It seems to me if I could just
Go ahead.
jump in,
Yeah.
but why one reason we would be interested in it is the relation between faith and reason.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about that, I'm going to use the chalkboard here.
And I can get more chalk. That's if they're not.
No,
pieces of-
there's plenty here.
Okay.
We often counterpoise these to each other as if they're two separate domains, right? There's the domain of faith, and there you have to know things through revealed truth, Scripture. Those who weren't around when that Scripture was written, presumably through the actual Christ event, seeing the guy, spending time with him, being influenced by him. And then there's reason, and reason is something purely natural. You don't need faith at all in order to make it work. But what is this? This is a particular philosophical perspective, isn't it? It's also a particular theological perspective. And it may be one that a lot of people assume. And in our society, it's sort of the de facto starting point. But if you're really doing good philosophy or good theology, do you make a lot of assumptions like that without spelling them out, or without arguing for them, or seeing whether they're actually the case?